I realized that if I don't fire Bob, I'm going to lose all my best performers. Because not only have I been unfair to Bob not to tell him, I've been unfair to the whole team. How you can minimize the time on politicking at your company. One of the things you can do is not to make a huge deal of promotions. That's why you want to praise in public, is when you praise one person for doing something, everyone else learns what good looks like, and that's really important.
This is the Growing Forward podcast with Mik and Trav.
In this episode, we're joined by New York Times best-selling author Kim Scott.
That's right. Join us in our conversation about her book, Radical Candor, and how it ties into communication and leadership today. So welcome back to another episode of our podcast. We're here with Kim Scott today, renowned Silicon Valley leader in companies like Google, Apple, Twitter, many others. Not to mention entrepreneur and New York Times best-selling author, famous for your book, Radical Candor, among others. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much. It's awesome to be here.
Yeah, great to have you two here, all the way in Copenhagen, Denmark. Actually,
yes.
So a long way from home today.
Thrilled to be here. We've had a great time here in Copenhagen.
Yeah, that's great. And I know you're not a stranger from being far from home. You've done a lot of traveling and living abroad in your life as well.
Yeah, I lived for about 4 years in Moscow, in Russia. Actually, that's where I started my career, in fact, and then have flown all over the place since then.
That's amazing. That takes a lot of courage. It's not an easy thing living abroad. I know we're really curious sitting here. What inspired you to write the book, Radical Candor? Where did that come from within you, and what did you hope to put out into the world because of it?
In some respects, my entire business career was a giant plan to subsidize my novel writing habit. So writing is actually my first love.
Okay.
And I became a manager so I've written several other novels sort of on the side as throughout my career. And I realized that a lot of the things that I explored in my novels, I could explore by explaining management. Like so much of the drama, of the human drama of life gets expressed in the manager-direct report relationship. And I think this is a relationship that causes a lot of misery for both sides.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be that bad. It's possible to have a good relationship between manager and their direct reports.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's that specific relationship? Because when you put it like that, I completely get it, right?
Yeah.
It's like, is it because when you get hired, then you're kind of like forced into a situation? Or why do you think that dynamic is so weird compared to other?
I think we struggle in all our relationships, actually.
Okay.
Relationships are hard.
Yeah.
But this one gets less attention than the others. You know, it's funny, when I started my first company, I was talking to a friend about it, and he looked at me and he said, "This is going to be hard for you because you hate the man, and now you are the man, and you're not a man." And so it was like, complicated on many different levels. So I think we have power is a problem. Powerlessness is a bigger problem, but power is a problem. And so a big part of Radical Candor is about sort of taking a look at that power imbalance. And if you have the power in the relationship, if you are the manager, learning how to lay it down and get on a level playing field and build real human relationships with each of your direct reports. Because there are very few things that are more damaging to a human relationship, I think, than a power imbalance. So I think a lot of it is figuring out how to deal with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know Mikkel and I, we've had our own company. We have our own company now. We've had it built up a bit bigger in the past. And I know we also struggled with how do you balance the endless list of like the work tasks, like that task list with building time to build that trust and personal relationships.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for people who are sort of struggling with that, and how can they lay that power down a bit?
Yeah. It's funny. There was one point in my career when I came into the office and I had set aside 2 hours to make a pricing decision for the company. This is when I was co-founder and CEO of a software company. And I walked in, and one of my employees came up to me, and he was very upset because he was about to have a major operation. He had a big medical situation going on.
Okay.
And so I spent some time talking to him and convinced him he should just go home and take care of himself in preparation for his surgery. And then I was walking to my desk to make this pricing decision, and I passed by another person whose child was in the intensive care unit in the hospital. Oof. And so I knew I couldn't just say, "How's it going?" So I stopped and talked.
That doesn't quite cut it.
Yeah. I stopped and talked to him for a while and convinced him also to leave and go, take us. Even if he didn't need to be in the hospital, he needed to take care of himself. He needed to go take a swim. He hadn't slept in 4 days. So I wasn't going to do any work, Now I'm an hour into my 2 hours that I had set aside to make. And I walked by another person on my team whose child had just won like the best mathematician in New York City. And so now I had to celebrate with him, and I feel like emotional whiplash.
Yeah.
And then, so now I have 45 minutes left to make this pricing decision. And I was wrung out. I was not in any frame of mind and I called my coach and I said, am I some sort of therapist or am I a CEO? and she started yelling at me and she said, "This is called management and it is your job." And it was a real wake-up call because these relationships that you form with people, it's not an extracurricular. It's not like making the pricing decision was my job and these other things were extra. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've got to do both, but I think if you've got to make time for both.
Yeah.
And you've got to make sure that you have enough slack in your schedule that you can rise to the occasion when it's called upon. But it's hard. It's really hard to be. I feel like sometimes leading a company can feel like you're sort of a projection screen for everybody's unresolved authority issues.
Yeah.
And that can feel unfair. And at the same time, when you become a leader, you often, in the eyes of others, are a jerk, even if you are not a jerk in your own eyes. And that's, for most people, really uncomfortable. Yeah. And for the people it's not uncomfortable for, those are the psychopathic leaders. And that's not better either. So all this sort of swirling around in my head was what made me decide I needed to sit down and try to just make sense of my own experience as a leader. And I'd been a leader in a bunch of different situations. I'd started a couple of several failed startups, I'll put it that way. and then I joined Google, and that worked out much better. And then I worked at Apple for a while, and then I became CEO coach. And so I had kind of a set of experiences that I thought were interesting, and I like to write. So that's that's part of why I wrote the book.
When did writing become such a passion for you?
Oh, since I could keep a journal since I was 5 years old.
Okay.
It's always the way I've processed. It's interesting to think about why are some people able to live so joyfully and productively, and why are other people so miserable? And, we all have some of both in our life. But I felt like early on in my career, I had several jobs that really did make me miserable. And in 1999, I actually quit. And I was like, this is the year that I'm going to learn how to be happy. That's what I'm going to do this year. And that was 1999 felt like a good year to learn that. And so some of that is in Radical Candor as well.
I really like that there you just made a decision. This is the year I'm going to learn how to be happy. Because I was just curious after reading the book and hearing you now, when you look at this dynamic manager to employee, for example, mm-hmm. how much of that misery, is it just pure bad leadership, or is there also some aspect of some employees also not taking the reins in their own life and being like, you know what, I'm going to flip my own mindset here?
There's some of both. And I think it's important to remember that most bad leaders are not bad people, but they haven't learned how to manage. In fact, I went to business school. And at business school, I learned exactly nothing about managing people, not a single class.
Okay.
And I don't think any business school teaches this.
That's pretty surprising.
They teach finance, they teach strategy, they teach, accounting. You learn something about marketing. You learn about operations, but you don't learn about managing people. I think people tend to assume this is some kind of innate ability, and it is not. This is a learned skill, and yet it's rarely taught. It's very rarely taught. It was one of the things I struggled with. I felt like I learned the hard way. I learned by getting thrown into the deep end.
Yeah.
And when I sank, unfortunately, I dragged a whole team of people down with me. It wasn't just me sinking,
Yeah.
And so it was really important to me. Part of the joy of writing is like you get into your head, you make sense of your own experiences, and then you can share those experiences so that other people learn the easy way by reading what I had to learn the hard way by failing.
Yeah.
So that's a big part of the reason why I wrote the book too.
And the book is called Radical Candor. Can you, for someone who haven't read the book, just explain that whole concept?
Sure. So radical candor is about caring personally and challenging directly at the same time. So you can think of it like a the one thing I did learn at business school is that a good 2x2 framework will solve all of life's hardest problems. So care personally is the vertical axis and challenge directly is the horizontal axis. And when you do both at the same time, that is radical candor. When you challenge directly, but you fail to show that you care personally, that's obnoxious aggression. And sometimes people confuse radical candor and obnoxious aggression. Somebody will charge into a conference room and they'll say, in the spirit of radical candor, and then they'll act like a garden variety jerk. And that is not the spirit of radical candor. That is the spirit of obnoxious aggression. And obnoxious aggression is a big problem. It's a problem because it hurts other people. It is a problem because it's a waste of breath. Like if I'm a jerk to you, then you go into fight or flight mode, and then you literally cannot hear the words that I am saying. And so I'm wasting my breath.
Yeah.
It's also,
nobody benefits.
Yeah, nobody benefits. You might feel like you're being strong, but you're not communicating. you're just posturing. And then the other problem with it is, again, my view of humanity is that very few people are consistently jerks. Mostly we really fear winding up in obnoxious aggression. But the problem is that when we wind up there, when we realize we have been a jerk to someone, or maybe we haven't been a jerk, but we've hurt their feelings in some way, upset them in some way that we didn't mean to, it's not our instinct to go the right way. At least for me, you can tell me what your instinct is, but it's not my instinct to go the right way on care personally. Instead, I go the wrong way on challenge directly. And then I wind up in the worst place of all, manipulative insincerity. This is the false apology. If obnoxious aggression is front stabbing, manipulative insincerity is backstabbing. It is passive aggressive behavior, political behavior, all of the kind of behaviors that erode trust most quickly in an organization. And that is where the drama is, in either obnoxious aggression or manipulative insincerity. If you watch The Office or the HBO show Silicon Valley, you're going to see a lot of episodes about those behaviors. And when we complain about work, we're usually complaining about those behaviors. But those are not the mistakes that most people make most of the time. The vast majority of people make the vast majority of their mistakes in this last quadrant. This is what happens when we do remember to show that we care, but we're so worried about not offending someone or not hurting their feelings that we fail to tell them something they'd be better off knowing in the long run. Yeah. And that's what I call ruinous empathy.
Yeah, and actually, that was the one that I was the most surprised about. Oh, that's right. That's actually a really bad thing.
Yeah.
We're reading it because it's just like, like you're in the moment. If you're not like training yourself into these concepts and like really trying to improve, it's really easy to be like, I should really say something, but you know what? I don't want to ruin their day, or I don't want to make them feel bad. I don't want to feel bad. Yeah. I'm a little lacking courage in this moment or something. Yeah. And you're like, oh, it's fine. I'm being polite.
Yeah.
But you're actually hurting them.
Yeah. You think you're being nice, but it's not so nice after all. In fact, in order to explain what I mean by ruinous empathy, I'll tell you a story about one of the worst moments in my career.
Here we go.
Yeah, here we go. So I had just hired this guy. We'll call him Bob. And I liked Bob a lot. He was smart. He was charming. He was funny. He would do stuff like we were at a manager offsite, and we were playing one of those endless get-to-know-you games. And everybody was getting more and more stressed. It was a startup. There was a lot of work to do. And Bob was a guy who had the courage to raise his hand and to say, I can tell that everyone is really stressed. I've got an idea. It'll help us get to know each other, and it'll be really fast. Whatever his idea was, if it was fast, we were down with it. And Bob says, let's just go around the table and confess what candy our parents used when potty training us. I don't know if they do that here, but in the U.S., parents use candy to potty train their children. Weirder yet, everybody remembered. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would pull out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So Bob was a little quirky. It was fun to work with him.
Yeah.
One problem with Bob, he was doing terrible work.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrible work. It was so strange because he had this incredible resume, this great history of accomplishments, and I could not understand what was going on. I learned much later the problem was that Bob was smoking pot in the bathroom 3 times a day, which maybe explained all that candy that he had. And all the but I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew was that he was handing stuff into me, shame in his eyes. And I would say something to him along the lines of, oh, Bob, this is a great start. You are so awesome. You're so smart. We all love working with you. Maybe you can make it just a little bit better. So let's pause for a moment here. Why did I say that to Bob? Part of it was truly ruinous empathy. I really did like Bob, and I really did not want to hurt his feelings. But if I'm honest with myself, there was also some manipulative insincerity going on as well, because Bob was popular and Bob was also sensitive. Mm-hmm. And there was part of me that was afraid that if I told Bob in no uncertain terms that his work wasn't nearly good enough, he would get upset. He might even start to cry, and then everybody would think I was a big you-know-what.
Yeah.
So the part of me that was worried about my reputation as a leader, that was the manipulative insincerity part. The part of me that was worried about Bob's feelings, that was the ruinous empathy part. And this goes on for 10 months, and eventually the inevitable happened.
Yeah.
And I realized that if I don't fire Bob, I'm going to lose all my best performers. Because not only have I been unfair to Bob not to tell him, I've been unfair to the whole team. Because everyone's deliverables were late when Bob's deliverables were late. Other people on the team were not able to spend as much time as they needed to spend doing their work because they had to spend so much time redoing Bob's work. And so people were not able to do their best work. And the people who were most ambitious on the team, they were going to quit. They were going to leave and go work someplace else where they could do their best work.
Yeah.
And so I had failed them as their leader as I had failed Bob. And so I sat down to have a conversation with Bob that I should have begun 10 months previously. And when I finished explaining to him where things stood, he pushed the chair back from the table and he looked me right in the eyes and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And it's that question that's going around in my head. Yeah, you've all been there.
Yeah,
We've all
exactly.
been
Sounds
there.
familiar.
Yeah. He looked at me again and he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me." And now I realized that by not telling Bob, thinking I was being so nice, I'm having to fire him. Not so nice after all. But it was too late to say Bob. All I could do, because his reputation on the team was shot.
Yeah.
Even he agreed he should go. All I could do in the moment was make myself a very solemn promise that I would never make that mistake again.
That's interesting. Do you think, being in a startup and your guys' position with Bob, do you think he lasted that long because he was funny and he was able to pull that out in people? Because a lot of the times in stressful situations, if someone brings the mood up a little bit, you give them a little more credibility.
A little more slack.
Yeah, a little more slack. And then you can but sooner or later, that ends when you're like, now I have to miss my kid's birthday because I'm doing your job, Bob. It doesn't matter how funny you are now. Now I hate you.
Yeah, I think that was part of it. But I also think that the team was relying on me as the leader of the team to create consequences for Bob, to hold Bob accountable. That was my job. It was not their job to hold Bob accountable.
Yeah.
And so, I think if he had been maybe a little less popular, you would think, though, if people liked him, they would tell him,
Yeah.
right? If they cared about, like he asked a question. I thought everybody cared about me. Like, why didn't they tell me? And so I think it's not only the boss of the team who's responsible. I think this is a responsibility we have to our peers as well. And yet we often fail to do. Everybody, not only leaders, winds up in ruinous empathy.
We've actually tried that in our own company where we were not in a close direct with this person, and then everybody started hating the person. But we only found out afterwards when we had fired them.
Yeah.
And we're like, why didn't anyone say anything? Well, I don't know. And and there is really something about building a culture where everybody keeps each other accountable if you're not performing.
Yeah.
No matter how funny you are.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And also, people hold each other accountable for being jerks as well.
Yeah.
Because Bob, like, what if Bob wasn't funny and was a jerk instead? Often people don't give the jerks feedback either. They just people really don't like to give each other feedback.
Yeah.
And because this is a almost universal human trait, like I was teaching at a business school, I was doing a class on radical candor, and a student raised their hand and they said, feedback is a source of existential dread for me.
Okay.
And I think a lot of people feel that way about it. So it is the leader's job to solicit it first and foremost. Don't dish it out before you prove you can take it. That's the best thing you can do, actually, as a leader, to create a culture of radical candor, is to solicit it. And to respond well when you get it. It's not enough to salute and
That's part one and part two that you have to knock out of the park.
Both of those things. And then you want to give more praise than criticism. Radical candor is not all about criticism. That's a problem with the Bob. I'll criticize the Bob story. I'll self-criticize, which is praise. Like, your job as a leader, especially of a startup, is to paint a picture of what's possible. And praise is a better tool for that than criticism. So you want to, but you don't want to give the feedback sandwich. Oh, Kim, I like your glasses, I hate your book, but cool shoes. Like, that doesn't make me feel any better.
That's kind of easy to see through that one.
Yeah, and yet people do it all the time. It's ridiculous, and it makes me trust the critical feedback less too, to get that kind of meaningless.
Plus, like what you said before about going on that momentum, emotional roller coaster with the difference. If you're saying, like, you did something really good, but also bad, but also good, then they're just like, I don't know how to feel right now.
Yeah.
And like, I would also prefer it much to get it straight. Like, hey, I need to have a hard conversation with you. Here's some feedback.
Yeah.
And then just take it, like, get it like that.
And the other problem is you want to give praise that is meaningful, that really matters. And so most people, if you give them praise and criticism in the same conversation, will not hear the praise. And so that's also a problem with the so-called shit sandwich.
Why do you think that is?
I think that we have a negativity bias. I think we learn from mistakes more than from successes, for whatever reason. And so if we can learn to learn from successes, then learning becomes more fun. But I think just recognizing that when you make mistakes in math, you learn from the mistakes more than the problems you got right.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that's true kind of generally. That's how we learn from mistakes. And so we need to learn how to make learning from mistakes fun and not torture. And that, if it's true for math, it's even more true for sort of interpersonal sort of things, like for learning how to be radically candid.
Yeah.
If you think about it, 9 times out of 10, when you offer someone a little bit of criticism, they're like, "Oh, thanks for letting me know." You know, 9 times out of, but 1 time out of 10, you'll have a radical candor train wreck.
Yeah.
You know? And
you should coin that term. I love that. A radical candor train wreck.
And it's not really a train wreck. The person is crying, and you're not water soluble. You're not going to melt in tears. Or the person gets mad at you and starts yelling at you, or the person brushes you off. Like I did this, kind of the origin story of radical candor came when shortly after I joined Google, I had to give a presentation to the founders and the CEO about how the AdSense business was doing. And I walked into the room, and there in one corner of the room was Sergey Brin, one of the founders, on an elliptical trainer, stepping away, wearing toe shoes and a bright blue spandex unitard, super tight. Not what I was expecting or frankly wanting to see in the room. And there in the other corner of the room was the CEO doing his email like his brain had been plugged into the machine. So probably like all of you in such a situation, I felt a little bit nervous. How was I supposed to get these people's attention?
Yeah.
And luckily for me, the AdSense business was on fire. And when I said how many new customers we had added, the CEO almost fell off his chair. What did you say? This is incredible. Do you need more marketing dollars? Do you need more engineers on the project? So I'm feeling like the meeting's going all right. In fact, I now believe that I am a genius. And I walked out of the meeting. I walked past my boss. And I was expecting a high five, a pat on the back. And instead, she said to me, "Why don't you walk back to my office with me?" And I thought, oh, wow, I messed something up.
Getting called to the principal's office.
You didn't think, a promotion already?
No. I could tell this was not going to be good news. And she began the conversation not by telling me what I had done wrong, but by focusing on the good stuff, not in the shit sandwich kind of sense of the way, but really seeming to mean what she said. But of course, all I wanted to hear about was what had I done wrong.
Yeah.
And eventually she said to me, "You said a lot in there. Were you aware of it?" With this, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, like who really cared? And I kind of made this brush off gesture with my hand. I said, "Yeah, I know, it's a verbal tic. It's no big deal, really." And then she said to me, "I know this great speech coach, and I bet Google would pay for it. You want an introduction?" And once again, I made this brush-off gesture. I'm not getting the picture. I made this brush-off gesture with my hand. I said, "I'm busy. Didn't you hear about all those new customers? I don't have time for a speech coach." And then she stopped, and she looked me right in the eye, and she said, "I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you." I'm like, okay, here it comes. And she says, "When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid." Now she's got my full attention. Yeah. And some people might say it was mean of her to say I sounded stupid. But actually, it was the kindest thing she could have done for me at that moment in my career. Because if she had not used just those words with me, and by the way, this is a really important point. She never would have used those words with other people on her team who were perhaps better listeners than I was. But if she hadn't used just those words with me, I never would have visited the speech coach, and I wouldn't have learned that she was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. And this was news to me because I had raised millions of dollars for 3 different startups giving presentations. I thought I was pretty good at it. Yeah. It was almost like I suddenly realized I've been marching through my whole career with a giant hunk of spinach between my teeth. And nobody had told me that it was there. It was that moment that made me realize, A, why had no one told me about this? But B, what was it about my manager that made it so seemingly easy for her to tell me? Mm-hmm. And I mean, maybe it wasn't easy. She had to try 3 different times, but it seemed easy. But
she wasn't going to let you off the hook.
She wasn't going to let me off the hook. And that was when I realized that care personally and challenge directly was what helped her. I knew that she cared about me not only as an employee, but as a human being. Okay. When I moved from New York to California to take the job at Google, after my New York startup failed, I was lonely. I didn't really know anyone in California, and she could tell I was lonely. She introduced me to a book group, and I'm still friends with those people to this day.
Okay.
Wow.
Also, shortly after I took the job at Google, my father was diagnosed with late-stage cancer. And I was devastated, and she could tell I was devastated. And she said, Kim, go to the airport, fly home to Memphis, where you grew up, where your family is. You need to be with your family right now. Your team and I will write your coverage plan. That's what high-performing teams do for one another. We've got your back. And those were the kinds of things she did, not just for me, but for everyone who worked directly with her. She couldn't, of course, do them for all 5,000 people in her organization. No matter how talented you are, relationships don't scale. But when a leader treats their direct reports with that kind of care, it's much more likely that their direct reports, in turn, will treat their direct reports with that kind of care. And
bit of a trickle-down effect.
Yeah, it creates a culture of caring. And I don't believe in trickle-down economics, but I do believe in building a culture of caring. It was a really important moment kind of in my career.
Yeah. When you just talk about it, she sounds like an amazing boss to have. And also the way she was able to navigate that you were just brushing it off, because I think a lot of managers would hold that in. But how does it actually look when you say she cared for you? Like, on a practical level, because I think someone listening out there, they're like, I care for my employees, but how does it actually look like?
Yeah. I mean, part of caring personally is making sure that you respect people's boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to get creepily personal. But the kinds of things that she would do are like notice that I was lonely and introduce me to, it didn't take her too long to do that. It's a lot of caring personally is about noticing each other's humanity in the moment.
Yeah.
I also think that one-on-one meetings are a really important way to continue to get to know people as you work with them. Too often, managers will decide that they don't want to have those one-on-one meetings, because they don't want to get in the way. I'm just going to hire the right people and then get out of their way. And when I was coaching Dick Costolo when he was CEO of Twitter, he and I were having this conversation. He's like, that is such a ridiculous thing to say. It's sort of like, imagine if I told my wife, I'm not going to come home for dinner tonight because I don't want to micromanage you taking care of the children, Like, it wouldn't go very well.
That would not go well, no.
Yeah. And so to build a relationship with your direct reports, you have to spend time with them. And so those one-on-one meetings that you have every single week are really an important way that you get to know people. And I think it's really the most important thing about a good one-on-one meeting is your mindset.
Yeah.
Like, go into that meeting this is someone I'm excited to get to know, excited to spend time with. Like, you need to figure out how to look forward to your. So if that means you need to have walking one-on-ones, have walking one-on-ones. If it means you need to have it over a meal, have it over a meal. But make sure you also understand for each of your direct reports, some people would rather do these in the morning, other people would rather do them late in the afternoon. So accommodate their preferences as well.
Do you have like an example of a one-on-one that went particularly well and maybe one that didn't go well, just to kind of visualize a little bit on like what you kind of mean about that?
Yeah. At one point when I had started the software company, and I mean, once you're the founder of a CEO, you get so busy, you barely have time to go to the bathroom, and I hate being that busy. And so I began to resent every single meeting on my calendar. Like, there's a New Yorker cartoon that said, nope, Thursday's out. How about never? Is never good for you?
Yeah.
And I realized I started to feel that way about about the meetings with each of my direct reports. I'm like, do I really need to do this? And there's usually nothing pressing. It feels like a meeting you could skip. But I realized that I was scheduling these lunches with friends of mine to get out of the office and kind of clear my head. And I always looked forward to those. That was not something I dreaded in my day. And I realized I needed to bring that mentality to my one-on-ones. The other really important thing, I think, about a one-on-one that goes well is when your employee sets the agenda. And so I would be very careful. Like, a one-on-one that went badly was one where I saved up feedback that I should have given a week ago, after a meeting. I saved it up for a one-on-one. You don't want to save up giving your either praise or criticism, but especially not criticism. You don't want to save it up for a one-on-one, and you definitely don't want to save it up for a performance review. Those conversations should be these impromptu 2-minute conversations like my boss did, like right after the meeting, walk back to my office with me. I have found that's my time to listen to my employees. There's one thing, though, that I do at the end, and it's important that they know that I'm going to do it, which is I solicit feedback at the end of the one-on-one meeting. Because if I don't bake that into my regularly held meetings, then I often don't do a good enough job making sure that I am soliciting feedback. And it's also important for my employees to know that even if they feel uncomfortable giving me feedback, I'm gonna demand that they give it to me, and so they can prepare a little bit. They can be ready.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about the power of the 6-second pause.
Yes.
When you're asking that to kind of create that discomfort and give them the space to okay, now I have to say more. Can you speak a little bit about that and maybe anything else that you do to sort of build up that trust and rapport? So when you ask for the feedback, even though it's uncomfortable, they know,
get it.
Yeah, you actually get it, and they don't feel that something bad is going to happen because of it.
Yeah. I think that it's really important when you're soliciting feedback to first of all, think about what are the words that are going to come out of your mouth. Because if you say, do you have any feedback for me? I can already tell you the answer. Oh, no, everything's fine. Nobody wants to give you feedback except teenage children, if you have those. They really want to give you that feedback. That is a service they
Then you
offer.
get the unsolicited feedback.
Yeah, you get a lot of it. And you better be ready to listen, if you want them to listen to you in return. So you want to make sure that with your employees that you think about how you're going to ask. So the question I like to ask is, what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? But do not write down my question, because if you sound like Kim Scott and not like yourself, then the other person is not going to believe that you really want the answer.
Yeah.
So you really want to make sure that you are thinking about sort of your question, how you would ask it. So I was working with Krista Quarles when she was the CEO of OpenTable, and she said, Kim, I could never imagine your words coming out of my mouth. She said, the way I like to ask is, tell me why I'm wrong. Okay, that works too. No problem. But you want to make sure as you think about your question that it can't be answered with a yes or a no. Krista didn't ask, do you think I'm wrong? She said, tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that I forget whether it's an open or closed, but don't allow it to be answered with a yes or a no. The other thing you want to do with your question is you want to make sure that you're paying attention to how it impacts the other person. So you want to be authentic, but being authentic does not mean ignoring the impact that you're having on others.
Yeah.
And so there were a couple of people on Krista's team who found her question too aggressive, and she had to back it off for them. When I started the company, Radical Candor, with Jason Rosoff, he told me pretty quickly after we started the company, he's like, actually, I hate your go-to question. and he said, it's too open-ended, like it puts too much pressure on me. Can you narrow it down, like ask me about the meeting we just had or tell me what you were trying to accomplish and let me comment on that specific thing. Another question that Jason and I have found helpful, in particular, Jason tends to ask this, is where this week did I get involved where you wish I hadn't?
Okay.
And also where did I not get involved where you wish I had? I think one of the things that's tricky about being a manager of any sort is that you don't want to be a micromanager, but you also don't want to be an absentee manager, right? You want to be a thought partner. And for every employee that you have, being a thought partner is going to mean something slightly different. I like a lot of autonomy.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, some of my employees have told me they felt that I was neglecting them, that I was being an absentee manager.
Yeah.
But other of my employees that I've had like even more autonomy than I do. And so I was bugging them,
Yeah.
And so you want to make sure that you're adjusting for what the person needs. And everybody's needs are a little different.
That comes back to the whole thing we talked about in the beginning, is kind of personalizing it a little bit on the direct reports. What is it that you need from me? And everybody is different. But that's also what it makes it super difficult to be a manager, because you have your own biases and your own story and your own childhood trauma and everything. And you think the world is like this, and now you're gonna say, I know this because I'm in this position and I'm the founder, and now you start to move, but everybody wants to move in their own way.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part, right?
It's exhausting.
Yeah.
It's really exhausting, and it's also really fun.
Yeah.
I mean, there is really a thrill once you get a team clicked in and you've got the right people in the right roles and you've figured out how to work with each of them. It is like magic.
Yeah.
It feels like when it really works well, it's like, I don't know if you all ever watched the show, The $6 Million Man, the Bionic Man,
No. Heard of it, but I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Anyway, it's like you're the bionic man or woman, the bionic person. You can jump further because you become almost like mental prostheses for each other. And when you have someone who's really great at something and able to rely on someone else who's really great at something else, it's magical.
Yeah.
But it takes a lot of work. It doesn't happen automatically.
Yeah, that takes a lot of that. That is something I know, like we've always been working on, but it's like you don't reach an endpoint with that. It's just like a constant.
It's management. It's like exercise. It's not like you're going to exercise once and be fit for the rest of your life.
Could be nice.
Yeah, we wish, or diet, or whatever. There's a lot of things that get managed, not fixed forever.
Yeah, and in your book you talk. It reminds me a lot of when you mentioned the platinum rule versus the golden rule. Golden rule being
do unto others as they would have you do unto you. But what you really need to do is to do unto others as they want you to do unto them.
Yeah.
And other people want different things than you. That's just a fact of life. Yeah. And thank goodness they do, because if we all wanted the same thing, we'd all be fighting for it.
Yeah.
Very true.
What's one kind of exercise to when you hire new people to get them up to speed on that radical candor in your team, so that the team kind of knows, okay, Kim works like this with John, Kim works like this with Joanne. How do you get people up to speed on that when they come from something else and you hired like a superstar and now you're gonna be like, this is how we work in this team?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that is really helpful, and it sounds so sort of stupidly simple, but it's really helpful, which is, as the leader, you tell your story. So what is your story? What's that moment in your career where someone told you something that maybe stung a little bit at the time, but stood you in good stead? And what's your Bob story? What's the time when you failed to tell someone something, trying to be nice, and the results were not so nice after all? And if you can tell your team those stories and use the radical candor framework, use your stories to illustrate the radical candor framework, it'll mean so much more to them than if you use Kim Scott's stories, because who the hell knows who she is. So you want to use your stories. And then you want to get them to tell their stories. They've done these fMRI studies with people, and they get them to share stories, and our brains literally get on the same wavelength when we tell each other stories.
Really?
Yeah, it's amazing. And so it's really helpful because this is hard for all of us. And so understanding where other people are coming from, and you as the leader making yourself a little bit vulnerable. Like when you tell your story, you're telling about a time in your career where you screwed up.
Yeah.
And when you tell your Bob story, you're telling about a time when you didn't say the thing, and you're showing why that was such a problem. So when you make yourself vulnerable, that helps your team make themselves vulnerable. And that's really, we can't build these real human relationships if we're all have no vulnerabilities, When we communicate with each other we communicate on an intellectual plane and on an emotional plane at the same time as human beings. We just do. And if you pretend like there are no emotional signals, if you ignore or say be professional, don't take it personally, that then you're ignoring, you're tamping, and you're just not going to communicate very well.
Yeah.
And so getting people comfortable, and this is uncomfortable, but there's no a lot of radical candor is about pushing through that discomfort. The only way out is through. I don't have emotional Novocaine to offer. If I did, I'd probably give it.
Yeah.
But although it's dangerous, when you get your mouth numbed, you bite your cheek and you injure yourself. So actually, I wouldn't give. Novocaine.
I was almost thinking alcohol when you said emotional Novocaine.
Yeah.
But that would not be good.
Well, I don't know. I think alcohol may be emotional something else.
that's
Unleasher.
That's true.
Growing Forward is sponsored by Shaping New Tomorrow, State Energy, and Vestamar Consult.
You'll find links for our great sponsors in the description below. Cheers, Trav.
Cheers.
Because you wrote the Radical Candor book before COVID. And then we go into this whole new hybrid world where people are on screens, they're sitting far away from each other. How have that changed in terms of Radical Candor? Because we all know the struggles that you don't want to come off and do you have the same mimics and you're not face-to-face, so now you can't really tell. Is that something that you've been working on like after the pandemic, and how this whole new remote hybrid, how is that going on with Radical Candor?
Yeah, it's really interesting. In the original version of the book, I would say have these feedback conversations in person. And then all of a sudden it was impossible to do that. And I've learned a lot since then. One thing is there's a lot of evidence coming out of University of Chicago that we're not as good as we think we are at reading each other's facial expressions and body language. There may be more noise than signal there. And so if you have a choice between a video call and a phone call, they recommend a phone call.
Really?
Okay.
Yeah. And as I thought about it, I realized that that's part of the reason why the advice I gave for if you can have the conversation in person, the advice I gave was not to sit across the table from each other and stare at each other, but to take a walk together.
Yeah.
Because then you're not actually looking at the other person. You're listening to the words they're saying to you, and you're both looking in the same direction. We're mammals. And sometimes, especially in a tense situation, just looking someone in the eye can actually be an act of aggression. I think it's important to look each other in the eye and have real conversations. But sometimes for these, if it's if you have to share some criticism or if you have to hear some criticism, it may be easier not to be staring each other in the eye.
Remove one level of intensity, sort of.
Yeah. You're walking, because also these radically candid conversations, they're dialogues. They're not monologues. And so you want to make sure that you're listening with the intent to understand. And sometimes let's say I tear up. You may think I'm angry or sad, actually. You probably think I'm sad, but I'm actually angry.
Yeah.
I gave you the punchline. Because, I'm a woman. I've been taught since I was, not to get angry. It's not ladylike to get angry. And so I often don't allow myself to get angry. And instead tears will come to my eyes. But I'm not sad. I'm furious, And so, how would you know that,
Yeah.
There's some benefit. So let's use the hybrid work environment to our benefit, and a phone call may be better than an in-person. They've shown for sure that a phone call is better than a video call for a sort of feedback conversation.
Okay.
They're not willing to say it's better than in person, but I'm going to say maybe it is.
Yeah.
Maybe walking side by side is like the in-person phone call.
Yes,
in some way.
Exactly.
But it's funny that you say that, because now you just got me reflecting that some of the best talks and deep talks and vulnerable talks that I had with my spouse, we've been out walking.
You're walking, yeah.
And there's just something about, as you say, you have time. We're usually in nature, but having your own space, but you're taking inputs.
Yes.
You're transforming it in your own pace, and there's room for not just like, why are you not answering me? Why are you getting upset? And you can even cheer up, but it doesn't.
But the other person doesn't see it
exactly, and it doesn't have the same impact on the other person.
Yeah.
That's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
The discomfort doesn't rise as fast.
Yes.
So you can give those 6-10 seconds more comfortably than
because you're walking and there's also you're listening to the words the other person is saying, but maybe there's something beautiful. There's it's interesting. So that's just for these 2-minute impromptu calls. There's also, I think, some benefit. Like let's say you're having a Zoom or whatever platform you're using. You're having some kind of conference, video conference meeting. And somebody makes a mistake in the meeting, and you want to do the equivalent of walk to my next meeting with me.
Yeah.
You can easily text the person, probably wait to the end of the meeting so you don't knock them off their game, and say, will you call me? Can I call you as soon as this meeting is over? And then just call them. Like that's the equivalent of walk back to my office with me. And in fact, I found when I was working with the team and we were all in person, that it was very complicated to walk up to someone at the end of the meeting and say, walk back to me, because then everybody else was like, ooh, they're in trouble.
The emotion goes up like that.
Yeah. And so I would text them at the end of the meeting, come get me and walk with me. And so it turns out like a lot of the things that I did to make it work in person make even more sense when you're on a Zoom call.
That's a really good idea. I had to write that one down quick. Another concept that you wrote about in Radical Candor that actually I had a bit of a moment where I was like a little mind blown. It kind of took how I used to think and turned it upside down a little bit. Was this concept is there is no thing as A and B players, just a bad job for employees. And for me, in my journey, because a lot of text, a lot of books, a lot of whatever out there talks about A player, B player, hire the A players, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And you're looking for that like A player thing. And we've talked about it before where we hire someone and we're like, yeah, this guy's going to be an A player. This girl's going to be an A player. And then
woman,
exactly.
Not hiring children.
Thank you. and then we go, maybe they weren't, or, but then the way that you described it, and also in terms of rock stars and superstars, can you describe that a little bit? Because that was quite impactful for me.
Yeah. I think that one of the mistakes I made throughout my career was I thought everybody had to be on a steep growth trajectory. Everybody had to be in what I call superstar mode. And there was one point where I was at a startup and we had this wonderful guy who did customer support. And I mean, our customers loved us because of him.
Okay.
So they would send us donuts. Like, forget about your NPS, your Net Promoter Score. Like, when your customers are sending your support person donuts, that person is doing something right. And partly as a result of his work, we were growing quickly, and we needed to hire more customer support people. And so I went to him and I said, "Do you want to lead the team, the bigger customer support team?" And he said, "No, I don't. My real goal is to be a Broadway actor. And I'm in all these off-Broadway shows, and it's really important that I can leave at 5 o'clock so that I can go and, if I'm managing these teams, this team, I won't be able to do that." And, in retrospect, I made a terrible mistake because I sort of wrote him off. Oh, he's not ambitious, and he doesn't want the next big job. And I hired someone who was super ambitious, and this guy really wanted to be the CEO. He kind of even looked down on customer support work. And he treated this guy like a quote-unquote B player. He would even call him a B player. Not surprisingly, the guy got pissed off and he quit and he went and worked somewhere else. and the business started to shrink, and, then this, guy who had ambitions to be the CEO was in a situation where he had to do the job, not just manage the people. And he did a terrible job because he didn't respect the work and he didn't respect the people doing the work. And so I think a really important part of building a company is respecting all the work that you're doing and respecting all of the people who are doing the work. And at the same time, you want to figure out who wants, because some people do want to be promoted and other people don't. And the people who sort of are on a steep growth trajectory are in superstar mode. And the people who don't necessarily want that next job, they don't want to grow fast in their career, but they're doing a great job at their current job, those people are in rockstar mode. And it's important not to assign labels. That's why I say not superstars and rock stars, which is tempting, but superstar mode and rockstar mode.
Mode, okay.
Yeah, because we all have different moments in our career where we're in one mode or the other. And I think as leaders, some leaders will over-index on the people in superstar mode.
Yeah.
That's especially at startups. That's a common mistake. And other leaders will clip the wings of people in superstar mode because they'll be threatened by them. When I first got to Google, Larry Page, one of the founders, told me a story about this where he had taken a summer internship. And his boss at that summer internship told him what his project was and sort of how to do it. And Larry had a different idea for how to do it. And it was going to allow him to finish that project in one day, not 3 months. And this was a threat to the boss, and the boss wouldn't let him do it that way. And Larry was so frustrated. He said, I never want anyone at Google to be in that situation. Like, I want people to be able to do their very best work all the time and not to. So Google sort of was really good about making sure that leaders couldn't clip the wings of people in superstar mode. But Google didn't always do as good a job as it should have honoring the work of people in rockstar mode. And I learned about this when I got to Apple. And there was an executive I worked with at Apple, and she said, well, you got to manage people in superstar mode and rockstar mode differently. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you? And she was the one who explained to me. And Apple was very good at honoring its rock stars. And I think that's part of the reason why Apple has been so successful, actually, is there are a lot of people at Apple who've had the same job for 20, 30 years, and they're great at it. And it also leaves them room for whatever else is going on in their lives.
How do you, because I can see, or my assumption is that there can be a lot of friction between the superstar mode and the rockstar mode in organizations. How do you manage that practically in a place like Apple? How do you actually honor them from a management perspective while having someone who is like outworking everyone, taking more tasks on, and maybe sacrificing their personal life to a degree that they can keep rising up? How do you manage that?
Yeah. So I think that the important thing is to realize that for people who are in superstar mode, first of all, for everyone, there's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And you want to be able to reward both intrinsically and extrinsically. And so when people are in superstar mode, the extrinsic reward that they get is usually a promotion. And that promotion usually comes with some additional stock and some additional money, as well as additional responsibility. People when they're in rockstar mode, they don't necessarily want that promotion. But when you have two people, one is in superstar mode, one is in rockstar mode, the person in superstar mode is not yet ready for a promotion, but they're getting ready. You still pay the same bonus to the person in superstar mode and rockstar mode because they're doing equally great work at that level. And I think too often people, and this is it's really important to design your systems of promotion and pay to be fair to both, to everyone. But when we're talking specifically about rockstar mode and superstar mode, they should get the same bonus because they're both doing equally great work at that level. And very often what happens is that a leader will give all the highest ratings to the people in superstar mode to rationalize their promotion.
Yeah.
And so it can be really useful to identify people who are in the different modes and say, we're getting this person ready for promotion, but we're not doing that by unfairly underpaying people in rockstar mode. So I think that's one thing. I think you also want to make sure that you don't make a big public brouhaha about promotions. You don't want promotion-obsessed culture.
Yeah.
So for a bunch of reasons. One is that it can make the people who don't get a promotion but who are doing great work feel like they've done something wrong.
That was what I was thinking.
Yeah. The more important reason is that it can hurt innovation. If people are spending a lot of their time not so much doing the work, but politicking for the promotion, and that we've all seen that happen, then it really hurts innovation. There's a great book called Loon Shots, and Safi Bahcall, who wrote the book, does a lot of work understanding sort of how you can minimize the time on politicking at your company. One of the things you can do is not to make a huge deal of promotions. This is not something I think a lot of people understand, but you also don't want to have the pay between the CEO and the new employee too great. Because if there's a huge pay difference between being director and VP, then people are going to spend all their time getting the VP as opposed to doing the work. And then it will leave people who are in rock star mode feeling like a chump, basically.
Undervalued.
Well, they'll feel underpaid. I mean, and that's a mistake that Google made. There was such a steep trajectory. A VP would get paid, 10 times more than a director who was getting paid 10. Like there was a big step up. Huge step up. Google was paying quite well. So if you compared like a entry-level job at Google compared to an entry-level job, for example, at a startup, the Google employee was getting paid a lot more. Mm-hmm. And I was advising a lot of startups, and my husband was at Google. The startups were all like, oh, we can't hire. Like, we can't compete with this. And meanwhile, Google has this Google Geist survey. And what were people most unhappy about at Google? Pay. Because the difference was so great.
Everything is relative.
Everybody felt like they were underpaid compared to their boss, which they were, in fact.
That's so interesting, right? That you can be above industry standard, but if the relation to the next step is so large, then that's what you relate yourself to. You don't relate yourself to the other guy in the startup.
Yeah. And the other thing about it is, I think like for some reason people have this idea that kind of pay differential is essential to Silicon Valley's success, but it is not. That is a myth. Peter Thiel is full of shit. I'm just going to say it. That is a myth. Larry and Sergey, when they founded Google, thought it was going to be a nonprofit.
Okay.
Yes. Wow. If you read their early papers, they didn't think they could do this they figured out clearly how to do it, or Shona Brown figured out.
That's evolved a little bit.
Yeah, that has evolved. It's not a nonprofit for sure. At a certain point after Google went public and the IPO went way better than anybody even expected, Google called the early Googlers who got a lot of stock and made a lot of money, they called them economic volunteers, in recognition of the fact that they were not working for money anymore. They were working because they liked the work. And the thing that Google could do to retain them was to give them good working conditions and to honor them and respect them for doing their work. It wasn't necessarily more and more and more money.
That's really interesting because it's so counterintuitive to how a lot of people think about it today.
Yeah, it is. I think the fun and the joy of a startup is the fun and the joy of innovation. It's the intrinsic motivation. And I think that Silicon Valley, it's killing the goose that laid the golden egg. The money is killing the goose. It's paradoxical because once people start focusing too much on the extrinsic, on making money, they're no longer focused on the things that they need to do to innovate. And that's a big problem.
Is there also something about like the being fulfilled there, that then the innovation goes away because why they actually got into that role was maybe to do X, Y, Z fulfilling job, but now they got into an environment where the whole pay and all of that becomes so competitive that you kind of lose focus of that, and you
Yeah.
also lose the fulfilling a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of evidence that shows that too much focus on extrinsic motivation can kill intrinsic motivation. And it's really the intrinsic motivation that leads us to do the very best work of our lives, that is fulfilling, that makes us happy. There's a huge amount of evidence that shows that after making a certain amount of money, which is not that much, like once you can fulfill your basic needs, poverty definitely makes you unhappy. I don't want to be too Pollyanna-ish about it. But the difference between having, $100,000 and $1 million gives you no, and certainly the difference between having $1 million and $1 billion, there's no happiness. And $1 billion and $100 billion, there is probably negatively correlated.
Yeah. In your book, just to take a little bit of a turn here, there's another section that also was quite enlightening, and I thought you just had a lot of great perspective on it, and that's the topic of gender guidance and how can we sort of navigate this hot topic of gender inequality and all the other inequalities also that's a huge problem in work today. And as a couple of straight white males sitting here as well, and how do we promote more equality or equity within the working environment, and where do we go wrong in these interactions as it relates to radical candor and in these conversations that are difficult to have?
Yeah. I think I didn't write enough about that in Radical Candor, and that's why I wrote my next book, Radical Respect, which just came out recently. So shortly after Radical Candor came out, I was at a tech company in San Francisco giving a Radical Candor talk, and the CEO of that company had been a great friend of mine, a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person who I like and respect enormously, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And after I gave the Radical Candor talk, she pulled me aside and she said, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor, Kim. It's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture that I need. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer someone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, they would call her an angry Black woman.
Wow.
And I knew this was true, and I knew how unfair it was. She's like one of the most reasonable, even killed people I've ever worked with.
Okay.
And as soon as she said that to me, I realized 4 different things at the same time. The first thing that I realized was that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I had failed to be an upstander. Yeah. Instead, I was a silent bystander. I hadn't considered the toll it must take on her to have to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant. So I had been kind of in denial about what was happening to her. The second thing I realized was that I had also been in denial about what had happened to me as a woman in the workplace. I had pretended that a whole host of things had not been happening to me that had, in fact, been happening. These sort of disrespectful attitudes and behaviors. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. But the third thing I realized was that even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I want to think of myself as the culprit. And so I had been even more deeply in denial about the kinds of things that I had done, the kinds of disrespectful attitudes or behaviors that I had exhibited that made it harder for the people around me to get their work done. And the fourth thing was a big moment. Feedback is really useful. It can make you realize a lot of things at the same time. The fourth thing that I realized was that I sort of imagined that I was creating these bullshit-free zones where everybody could do the best work of their lives and build the best relationships of their career. But I realized that as a leader, by pretending that these disrespectful attitudes and behaviors were not happening when they in fact were, I was failing to prevent them from hurting my team's culture. So that made me sort of take a pause and think about what are the things we can do as leaders, what are the things we can do as upstanders, what are the things we can do when we're harmed by disrespectful attitudes and behaviors, and what are the things we can do when we ourselves have exhibited disrespect. How can we become part of the solution, not part of the problem? And that's kind of the way I structured Radical Respect, around those different roles. And I tried to identify what are the things that get in the way of her. Because if we don't respect people, we're not going to challenge them or or care about them, you know?
Yeah, then you're more indifferent.
Yeah. You kind of try to avoid them usually. And by the way, by respect, there's two different definitions of respect. One is something you have to earn, but the other is something that we owe to everyone regardless, kind of unconditional respect. It's the regard that we owe everyone for who they are, for their background.
Human to human.
Yeah, for their humanity. Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of respect I'm talking about here. So what gets in the way of that kind of unconditional respect? A million things, but I'm going to boil it down to three. Bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think very often we confuse bias, prejudice, and bullying as though they're the same thing. And if we break it apart, then it's easier to solve it. Like a hard problem, you break it into its component parts and you solve it in turn. So I define bias as not meaning it. It's unconscious, the kind of bias I'm talking about. Prejudice, I'm going to define as meaning it. It's a very consciously held belief. And bullying, I'll define as just being mean. So not meaning it, and being mean. And you want to respond to each of these problems differently. As an upstander, you can respond to bias with an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. One of my favorite stories about this comes from a friend of mine who went into a meeting with two colleagues who were men, and she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. So she sat in the center of the table. Her two colleagues sat on her left. When the other side came in, the first guy came in and sat across from the guy to her left. The next guy came in, and it was all men except for her, sat across from the guy to his left, and then everybody else filed on down the table, leaving her dangling by herself in the center of the table. She started talking, and when the other side had questions, they directed their questions at her two colleagues who were men. It was like she wasn't in the room.
Oh, okay.
You've noticed that it happens, I promise you, in almost every meeting, everywhere. It's not, and not because those guys were they just were unconscious of what they were doing. It happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time, and one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think we should switch seats." That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. That was an I statement. It was sort of like holding a mirror up to the And then they realized what they were doing and they stopped doing it. It was no big deal. And why did he want to be an upstander in this case? He wanted to be an upstander because he wanted to win the deal. And he knew that they couldn't win the deal if the other side wasn't listening to her. He also did it because he knew it was easier for him than for her. It wasn't that he thought she couldn't stand up for herself, but it was going to be easier for the people who caused harm to hear it from him than it would have been from her. So there was an efficiency argument for intervening. And thirdly, he did it because he liked her and he didn't like seeing her get, there's an emotional side of it too. Yeah. And so that's an example of sort of how an upstander can use an I statement to create a better working environment and a better result. If it's prejudice, however, holding a mirror up is not going to work because the person is going to grin in that mirror. They're going to like what they see, Example of this comes from I had just returned to work from maternity leave. I had just had twins. And I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting, and he said, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children," which, of course, felt like a gut punch to me. But I didn't think he quite meant it the way it came off. I thought it was unconscious bias. And so I said, "Oh, well, I decided to show up at work today because I thought it'd be a good idea to neglect my children, and I was expecting him to have that response,
a nice
to laugh
disarming
and apologize,
joke.
And we would, but no. He double-clicked. He was like, "Oh, no, Kim, it is really not good that you're back at work."
Oh.
I've got all these research studies, and so now I know it's prejudice, not bias.
Okay.
And so now I use an it statement. An it statement can appeal to the law, it can appeal to a policy, or it can appeal to common sense. So I chose an HR policy, and I said, "It is an HR violation for you to tell me that I'm neglecting my kids to show up at work." And that had the desired response. He sort of backed off. And I said, "Look, I'm not going to over-delegate to HR. I'm not going to report this to HR. But I think you and I can agree that it is now I'm appealing just to common sense. It is my decision, together with my partner, how we raise our children just as it is your decision together with your wife how you raise yours. And he kind of, grudgingly admitted that this was true. And then I said, look, I'm guessing you don't want to read my research any more than I want to read your research. Let's just agree to just. And I'm not saying that solved all the problems, but we were able to work together with that. He could believe whatever he wanted, but he couldn't impose that belief on me.
Yeah.
And so that's an it statement. However, if the person is trying to bully you, and he really wasn't trying to bully me, he actually thought he was giving me useful information.
Yeah.
If the person is bullying, like showing someone where a boundary is not going to work, because when a person is bullying, they're always pushing past the boundaries. And you also don't want an I statement. An I statement kind of brings someone in to understand things from your perspective. But if someone's bullying you, you don't want to bring them in closer. You want to push them away.
Yeah.
I learned this from my daughter when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground.
Oh.
And I was encouraging her to use an I statement. Tell this child, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? And I was like, oh, that's
Wisdom.
a really
Getting
good
the
point.
truth from a 3rd grade.
Yeah, 3rd grade.
Some good wisdom right there.
Yeah. That was a really good point. So I realized a you statement is better to response to bullying. You can't talk to me like that. Or even a you question. What's going on for you here?
Yeah.
Or even a you non sequitur. Like, where'd you get that shirt? The point is, with your you statement or question or non sequitur, you're not accepting whatever they're dishing out at you. You are in an active stance and you're the one asking the questions. And, again, these I statement, it statement, you statement, not going to solve all the world's problems.
Yeah.
But they help you to know what to say when you don't know what to say. They can help
it gives you like a sense of confidence, perhaps. You kind of you have the tools lined up.
I think the hard thing is to start. And so it gives you a place to start. And then if it goes off the rails, but at least momentum, you've got momentum on your side.
I really imagine that takes a bit of practice too, because the way that you confronted your colleague saying with the it going from the I to the it statement, right?
Yeah.
That I can imagine that taking a lot of courage. And another thing that you talk about in the book as well that I think is really important. And you also I because I'm thinking about it now and really trying to work on it myself, I can remember that you've also helped me in this conversation when I said guys and girls instead of women, right? It's the language that we use.
Yeah, words matter.
Yeah, words matter. And just you have a good story about instead of saying, hey guys, because in the English language, if there's men and women, we say guys.
You all.
Yeah.
I'm from the South.
Y'all, right?
Y'all.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about language and how that impacts these conversations with radical candor in leadership? Yeah,
absolutely. There was a CEO who I was working with, and he tended to stand up in front of his team and say, hey, guys. And I said to the CEO, and he was really working on improving diversity at the company. And again, why was he doing that? He realized that it was really important to get the right talent. If they weren't hiring women, it was not because women were not talented. It was because they were overlooking important talent in the market. And so he was working on making sure that they were fixing this problem. And so I said to him, when you stand up in front of your whole company and you refer to them as guys, and 70% of them are guys, but 30% are not, and you're trying to make it more, get it to 50-50, you're not helping yourself. And he thought about it, and he's like, you're right. That is excluding people. And maybe not everybody feels excluded, but if half the women feel it, like I've just excluded 15% of the people who I want to include. And so he really worked on learning how to say, he decided he wanted to use the word team. I encouraged him to use you all, and he's like, I just can't do that.
Hey, y'all.
Make it your own again.
Yeah, exactly. I don't care what word you use, but make it, gender inclusive. Yeah. But it was hard for him. Like undoing these deeply ingrained habits of speech is hard. And it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
And and he had, in order to change his language, he had to make himself vulnerable. He had to tell people, I'm working on this. This is a mistake that I'm going to continue to make, and you need to continue to correct me, and even bought some styrofoam rockets on a rubber band, and you were allowed to shoot them at him if he said, you guys, make it a joke. I think sometimes one of the problems is we make this so heavy, and to try to lighten it up a little, but also to make ourselves vulnerable is really important.
I think you're onto something there where I'm like, sometimes when you hear the old white men thing, and you see someone on LinkedIn and they're just going head to head on a gender discussion, and I just thought about that, where it's like the older generations of men, maybe they actually don't know how to be vulnerable, and that's what it takes, because they've been ingrained with culture to say girls or all this stuff, and what it really takes is to get or to be vulnerable and essentially take a beating. To remove that of your vocabulary and become inclusive in a new modern society where it's more inclusive. And that just got me thinking that must be why these older white men typically go in the defense, is because they haven't learned how to be vulnerable, and which is what it really takes. So they choose the other way, which is like fighting and becoming like defensive and say, it's because the woman wasn't the perfect candidate for this and blah, blah, blah. And there's not enough women in engineering and we couldn't hire them and blah, blah. And they go really into defense. Is that something that you can kind of recognize that could be some of the troubles that we're having converting these older white men to more inclusiveness?
I don't think the problem is age or gender. I think the problem is power, right? And so I think very often, in fact, there's some really interesting evidence. You hear a lot about how men tend to interrupt women in meetings. But Kieran Snyder, who's done a lot of interesting research into this, has found that the people who are the worst interrupters are powerful women.
Oh,
yeah. See, there you go. And I don't think it's because women interrupt more than men or men interrupt, but people in power indubitably tend to interrupt more than people not in power. And I think we live in a society where the people who have power tend to be men. So we attribute interrupting to men, but it's not like a male thing or a female thing. It's a power thing. And this is part of as you become a leader, you don't want to interrupt your team. Like you've hired people because you want them. Steve Jobs said, we hire people at Apple to tell us what to do, not the other way around. But if you're interrupting them all the time, you're not giving them an opportunity to tell you, to show what they know. Yeah. And so this is like a paradox of power, is that it can destroy what you're trying to create when you have the position. And so learning how to lay that power down, regardless of who you are, is really important, I think. It's interesting, when I was writing Radical Candor, so my father is an older white man, and he said to me, and it was like really heartfelt. He said, because I was saying, just say what you think. And he said, Kim, if I just say what I think, I get in so much trouble. And I felt really, it like really made me stop and think. He said, that is not the advice to give to me, at least. Like, I need to learn how to say it better. But also, I didn't want my father to be silenced. He had some wisdom. I wanted him to be able to share it. And so I think it's really helpful to try to not, criticize someone for their identity, whether it's older. Like I said, I have twins, a boy and a girl. And my daughter tends to say things about boys. And I said, look, if my son is, if your brother said the same thing you said about, but girls, like we would all come down on him like a ton of bricks. Yeah. You can't do it either. Like turnaround is not fair play in this. We need to make sure that inclusion is inclusive, that we're respectful to everyone.
Yeah.
I think you just explained why I get interrupted at home. So thank you for that.
You married a powerful woman.
Yeah,
Good for you.
exactly.
I'm curious, Kim, just stepping away from the book for a minute, because you have such a large amount of experience in these really famous Silicon Valley companies, and you've been in that ecosystem for so long. I found it really interesting when you were writing about the differences between some of the companies, because in my mind, I don't have
all the same thing.
Yeah, it's like this big, Silicon Valley, like the Google, the Apple, the innovation. It's like but there was there was differences, which I found interesting. But I'm like, what are some things that people don't know about working for these big Silicon Valley companies? Or can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best ways to describe the difference between Google and Apple is to describe the food at Google and Apple.
Okay, here we go. Here we go.
So at Google, the food is free, but it's kind of like a smorgasbord. Like there's a lot of everything. It's all delicious, but you kind of have to put your own meal together. There's all and often I wasn't very good at that. I'd wind up with a bunch of things on my plate that didn't really go well together. They were all individually delicious, but it didn't. Whereas when I got to Apple, you had to pay, but you got this beautifully composed meal, like as good as at any restaurant.
Okay.
That to me, like. Apple believes in controlling the user experience, and so they produce something beautiful when they control. Whereas Apple believes in identifying a small number of things and doing them really, really well. Whereas Google believes in let 1,000 flowers bloom, and it's more of a free for all. Like, it was funny. It made me really think. And I would say I liked working at Google better than working at Apple, but I liked the food at Apple better. Even though I had to pay for it.
And what made that difference between them that made you like working at Google better?
So I am a little bit of a chaotic person. And Google was like, you could just do anything, really. It was very much of free-for-all kind of culture. I would say it was a fast-moving, consensus-based organization.
Okay.
And at first I would have said that's impossible. Consensus is slow by definition. But the thing that they realized at Google is that if they put the onus on the naysayers, you didn't have to get a yes. You got an automatic yes. If someone wanted to block you from doing something, they had to work hard to block. They could block you, but they had to work hard. And that really there was an important moment in Google's history when it started to get big and it started to get a little bit bureaucratic. And Marissa Mayer, who was one of the product managers at Google, made this announcement. She said, the goalies have gotten too good. It's impossible to score, And so that was a really important, I think, developmental moment in the company's history where the CEO of Google started saying, ask for forgiveness, not permission. And he really meant it. And he encouraged people, be loud. And so those were parts of Google's culture that I really enjoyed. It was a very entrepreneurial culture. Apple's culture is also incredibly entrepreneurial, but in a much more controlled, managed way. Although still at Apple, there was great clarity about your category 1, category 2, category 3. So category 1 was the work that you were responsible for. And that nobody else could, including your boss or your boss's boss, they couldn't come in and tell you how to do it. You had real ownership over, what the work that you were the directly responsible individual for. And then there was category 2, and that was where you had to collaborate with others. And then there was category 3, and those were the things you were not invited to opine on. At Google, there was almost no category 3. And at Apple, there was a big category 3. And also, though, category 2 was huge at Google and could be exhausting. When I worked at Google, I had hundreds and hundreds of emails every single day. Oh. And when I first got to Apple, I only got 4 emails a day. I kept checking the Wi-Fi to see if it was broken. And it was a huge relief. That I loved about Apple.
I feel like I would do the same in that situation. What's going on?
Yeah.
We have a tradition on our podcast where we kind of have this jar of thought-provoking questions that we like to
All
just
right.
pull a question
Pull
out,
one out.
and see what comes out the other side.
Let's check it out.
If you're up for that. Okay, so if you could go back in time 10 years and show yourself the next 10 years of your life, what would surprise your past self the most, and what would impress them the most? And maybe what would you be the most proud of?
So I think for much of my career, I felt like my writing was 100% internal validation, 0% external validation, because nothing I wrote got published. And my career, I felt like my job, my startups and the job at Google and the job at Apple, I felt was 100% external validation. I was very well compensated.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel like I got as much. I wouldn't say it was 0% internal validation, but not like the writing
That's
was.
what you got from the writing.
Yeah. And so I thought that was just how my life was going to go. And then when I wrote Radical Candor and it was successful, I was able to bring the two things together in a way that was surprising and delightful for me. I never thought that writing a book about management could scratch that novel writing itch. But in fact, I realized it did. Like so much of the human drama, as I said, is in these experiences being a manager. So it was a great surprise, and I feel like I now am living the life I want to live.
Yeah.
I was going to say, how did that feel when you were able to bring those worlds together? Was there a moment when you were like,
it was too good to be true.
Yeah.
It was almost too good to be true. Like I could support myself by talking about the book I wrote, but it didn't take so much time that I didn't have time to write the next book. So I'm now able to live the life I imagined. It took a while, but I got there.
That's amazing. Is that what you're the most proud of in life?
Yeah, by far it's the writing and the ability to support myself as a writer. It's not easy to do.
No, I was just about to ask, what was the hardest thing about writing Radical Candor? If there's someone out there that has that experience and the writing itch, what is hard about writing a management book like that?
Yeah. So I think the second hardest thing about writing is getting inside my head. Like, because as I was writing the book, I was having constant arguments with myself, and I had to take time. It took a lot more time. I thought I could write it in 3 months. It took me 4 years. So it takes a lot. So that was the second hardest thing, was getting inside my head. But the hardest thing was getting back out, and that's where you need a great editor. And actually, I had more than 100 people on the Google document where I was writing it, giving me feedback. Feedback works. And so I needed other people to get back out of my head.
That's pretty impressive. A book on feedback and then 100 people to get feedback
a lot
in
of
the
feedback.
process.
I was walking the talk.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I want to say thank you so much for spending today with us and giving us a lot of your time. I know you're on a busy schedule and you're on your way back to do a whole bunch of other events right now. It's been really great having you on. I've been just taking a couple of bullet points that I just had to write down to take away from today. And like one bullet that has showed itself a couple of times is this concept of keeping in mind when you have these power differences to take a moment to lay the power down.
Yes.
To really get to know people on a personal level and just make trust and safety going both ways in all areas of relationships. Learning to learn from successes and failures, because then it becomes much more fun.
Yes.
Being critical of the wording that you use, both in language throughout, whether it be your own biases, but also when you're asking for feedback and things like that, and using the platinum rule. And I really like the last one as well with the I, it, and you languages for the different levels of
bias, prejudice, and bullying.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's been amazing having you on here. I feel like I just got the management USB plugged in and it got downloaded. And one of the things that I noted here was that a bad leader is per se not a bad person. And I think that's actually something that a lot of people forget.
Yeah.
They're not a bad person. They're just a bad leader.
Yeah, so if you have a bad boss, try to hold them accountable, but also have a little compassion for them.
Yeah, exactly. And then also that you're not communicating when you're in flight or fight.
Yeah.
That you're not taking it in. And also, as Travis just said, like laying that down and giving space to each other to actually listen.
Yes.
to not go into that. And then one thing that we, of course, like a lot of people, and I've really forgotten this sometimes, is like praise more than you criticize.
Yes. A lot more.
Yeah. And it's funny because it goes back to what you said about that we learn much more from the criticism. So I don't know if that's why we are going towards that, but we should really praise much more because it has less impact, but that's what we want to like pull out of people.
Yeah. Well, we want to learn how to learn from success.
Yeah.
It's actually really important. And the other thing is that this is why you want to praise in public, is when you praise one person for doing something, everyone else learns what good looks like. And that's really important.
And then you said something like relationships don't scale, and you followed up with that, but you can show the direct reports for you. Having a personal relationship with them shows them to do the same so that it actually trickles down in the organization.
Culture does scale.
Exactly. And then also just that the way care looks like is respecting personal boundaries.
Yes.
I think that's really important for people out there, especially if you're a technical founder and you're starting to start your own startup. Respect personal boundaries because we're all different.
Yes.
And then you said the last thing that I wrote down is this time to delivery of criticism. That right after the meeting, hey, can you walk with me, or the phone call, that you don't load up the criticism so that you come in on that one-on-one meeting with the guns blazing, you have all the ammunition.
Yeah, people are going to start to dread your one-on-ones.
Yeah, exactly. Kim, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you all so much. Great conversation, and I'm excited to see a whole new crop of entrepreneurs come out of your podcast.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you. Same to you.
You've been listening to the Growing Forward podcast.